Russia's defense against Ukrainian drones continues to fail on a large scale. Ukrainian drones are striking deep in the rear, with attacks occurring hundreds of kilometers behind the front. Even in the deep rear area, up to 150 kilometers behind the front, Ukrainian drones are constantly on the hunt. The situation in the south along the land bridge has escalated so much that Russia is closing the road to civilian vehicles. This comes as Ukraine reports successful attacks on an FSB base and a facility of Russian special forces, with well over 150 Russians killed in these attacks alone. This and everything else there is to report, here in this situation report on the Ukraine war. The Ukrainians have once again hit refineries. This time the refinery in Nizhny Novgorod and the refinery in Samara. This one was now 800 kilometers away from Ukraine. These constant attacks on both the refineries and the storage facilities have led to all refineries in central Russia either stopping production or at least reducing it, as reported here by Reuters. The refineries are responsible for 30% of Russian gasoline and 25% of diesel, and that likely explains the Ukrainian reports about oil wells being shut down. Because in the last situation report, we talked about how Zelensky said that a single Russian company had already had to close 400 wells because there was nowhere left to deliver the oil. And the point was that in one company there were 400 wells, but of course there are additional wells in all the other companies. According to Russian reports, according to a new report today, the Ukrainians hit a building in Starobilsk, which was said to have been a school. Several deaths and many injuries have now been reported. According to the Russians, most of them were teenagers. That's why Russia is now calling for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. On the one hand, it should be mentioned that plenty of schools and hospitals in Ukraine have been hit without there being a UN Security Council meeting. On the other hand, it must be emphasized very clearly that this cannot be a justification for a deliberate attack on students, which I explicitly am not suggesting. It is still unclear what happened there. So far, we only have the Russian statements. But if it was a planned Ukrainian attack, then at least in my opinion, it is possible that Ukraine believed that soldiers were being housed in that facility. As I said, we will hear the explanations at a later time. Meanwhile, the Russians are expanding their launch pads for jet-powered Shahed drones. So, for example, the Geran 5 and 6, which are being developed by the Russians, use a jet engine instead of a piston engine, and that makes them a bit faster. They are launched from ramps like these. However, the Ukrainians say that while the Russians have increased the number of drones by 35% since the beginning of the year, Ukraine has been able to double its interception rate using interceptor drones. So, to increase it by a much greater extent, Ukraine is currently planning to expand the production of interceptor drones exponentially. So production is expected to increase dozens, even many dozens of times. So the interception rate is likely to continue to rise as expected. Let's move on to developments along the front, and here we have footage from Sumy. It shows us a Russian fiber optic drone attack on Ukrainian soldiers, and here we can see that this is in the north of Sumy. We can also see how a fiber optic drone operates there, and how late the Ukrainian soldiers notice it in this case. As mentioned, it's also far enough behind the front that there are no nets installed by the Ukrainian side there. The whole thing has been geolocated here in the northeast of Sumy. Up here is the front line. If we take a rough look, this was about 20 kilometers away from the front itself. It was roughly here in these buildings, so if we place it here, roughly 20 kilometers from the front. Since the drones, of course, are not launched directly at the front, they traveled at least 25 kilometers. Here we can see how far the Russians are now able to operate with their fiber optic drones in this regard. We continue along the front. I don't have any changes on the ground from Sumy. We have no changes in Vovchansk, nor in Veliki Burluk. And the Ukrainians are now saying that the center of Kupiansk has been liberated. We can see that the Ukrainian deep state map no longer attributes any territory in the center of Kupiansk to the Russians. We also have here a statement from a Ukrainian officer, according to which the center of Kupiansk has been liberated. However, the Russians would continue to infiltrate in small groups, mostly through gas pipelines. In addition, the Russians would have some positions in the outskirts of the city. A few episodes ago, it must have been at least a month by now, I reported that a Russian mill blogger had already written an obituary for the Russian defenders who had barricaded themselves in the hospital here for months. Accordingly, he explained that they were no longer combat ready and would not be able to defend themselves anymore, that they would no longer be able to control it. Now we have confirmation from the Ukrainian side that the center of Kupiansk is no longer in Russian hands. As I said, previously we already had Russian confirmations pointing in this direction. That's all from the Kupiansk region. I have nothing to report towards Borowa. And towards Liman, we have an interesting development. We have a Russian mill blogger reporting that Russia is moving reinforcements from Kupiansk towards Liman due to heavy losses. If that's true, the pressure on Kupiansk would decrease soon, because there would naturally be less personnel available. And at the same time, this shows us that Russia is increasingly creating a main effort because it has to concentrate on a certain area. And if it's in Liman, then the intention is, of course, to penetrate the fortress belt from the north, namely Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Kostiantynivka. That's the Ukrainian fortress belt, still held by Ukrainians. But the focus should also be on your security and anonymity on the internet. And fortunately, today's sponsor can help with that. For work, I often have to access sites with geo-blocking. That's when I need a VPN. I've been using CyberGhost for 4 years now. CyberGhost VPN is one of the world's leading VPN providers. With more than 38 million users, the VPN hides the IP address, encrypts the data, and routes all internet traffic through a secure VPN tunnel. The VPN also allows access to over 40 popular streaming providers like Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, and BBC iPlayer, giving you worldwide access without geo-blocking. Servers in 100 countries can be used for both business and personal purposes. The software available for Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, smart TVs, game consoles, and Linux is not only user-friendly, but can also be operated without any technical knowledge. If any problems do arise, support is available around the clock, in German as well. Thousands of 5-star reviews on Trustpilot speak for themselves. As do over 38 million users, with one subscription, you can register up to 7 different devices at the same time. You are explicitly allowed to share the login details with your family. By clicking on the link below, you will receive an 83% discount and then get an additional 4 months for free. CyberGhost offers a 45-day money-back guarantee, so you take no risk at all. We continue further south along the front and towards Slovyansk. And towards Kostiantynivka, I can't document any significant change. From the direction of Dobropilia here, formerly Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk, we have reports from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians report that the Russians are now using more glide bombs and artillery, but at the same time, less infantry. In the attacks that are still taking place, they are experimenting, for example, now using electric bicycles instead of motorcycles to be quieter. It is mentioned here that motorcycles can be heard from 500 to 700 meters away. But with electric bicycles, Russian soldiers have a greater chance to advance without being heard. That means we see from the Russian side that there are still attempts to advance in this area, even though we can no longer really document any Russian successes there. But there are also fewer infantry attacks here. Everything indicates that the availability of Russian infantry is continuously decreasing. Further south, I only have something of significance again, coming from the direction of Hulyaipole. And there we have a Russian infiltration, specifically east of Vostvichivka. Here we have it in 2 places. That's roughly if we look at it on the map. Russian soldiers have been seen here and here. We've had this for a while now, that the Russians keep carrying out infiltrations west of Hulyaipole, and Russian soldiers are repeatedly discovered further back in the rear area, or in the area close to the front, but still behind the front line. That doesn't mean a shift in the front line yet, but it shows us that in this region, the Russians have the initiative. Further south, towards Orikhiv, we have an advance by the Ukrainians, which is being reported by Russian mill bloggers, specifically by Krymy Kaprisi, and there the Ukrainians are shown as being south of Malatovmachka. They are said to have advanced there. However, if we look at it here on the pro-Ukrainian deep state map, it's here, and that's in an area that the Ukrainians have already considered as theirs for a long time. However, the Russians have repeatedly claimed that they had captured the area, while they definitely entered Malatovmachka from the east for a while. The latest reports say that the Ukrainians have now permanently pushed them out of the village. They have completely liberated it again. We have not yet finally confirmed this, but the latest geolocations indicated it. This means that the Ukrainians are also successful here to a small extent. It's similar to the west of there, here along the old Kakhovka Reservoir. The Ukrainians have also been slowly advancing there over the past few weeks. When it comes to the situation behind the front lines, we have much more interesting reports today. For example, the Ukrainians report an attack on an academy for drone pilots of the Akhmat Ahmad Special Forces. Here we can see how the Ukrainians are launching a drone-on-drone attack. Let's speed it up a bit so we don't have to wait so long. We can already see the first fires there. So we see how drone after drone hits and causes damage there. And above all, we also see the damage caused to the buildings, which shows us the size of the explosives that were used here. Here, you can still see fresh impacts, sometimes even as other drones arrive. So, even in terms of the concentration of the attacks themselves, the Ukrainians have succeeded here to a good extent, and we can see the impacts and the fires in the buildings from the horizon. These were drone pilots being trained there, from the Akhmat Ahmad Special Forces, and according to the Ukrainians, 65 Russian soldiers were killed. At least to some extent, this is confirmed by the Russians. The next day, there is already a new report, and this time, the Ukrainians say they eliminated 100 Russian soldiers. This happened during an attack on an FSB base in the Arabat Spit. Arabat Spit. That's northeast of Crimea. We've sped it up a bit here as well. Here too, we can see again how the drones hit and the large detonations that occur. And that's significant, because these are relatively heavy hits behind the front lines with relatively large warheads. This means that the Ukrainians have to use drones that are larger than what has usually been used in this area in the past, in order to cause such damage to buildings, to practically destroy the buildings completely. Of course, along with everything inside them. The Ukrainians had to develop new drones that are big enough and heavy enough to destroy that. And they've obviously succeeded. Let's take a quick look at it on the map. In this case, it was roughly at this spot here. And if we measure it, we have a distance of roughly 150 kilometers to the nearest Ukrainian positions. But of course, the Ukrainians don't launch such drones directly from the front. That means the range is somewhere around 180 to 200 kilometers in this case, which shows us how far Ukrainian drones, now equipped with significant warheads, can be used, and how they continue to be successful. The Ukrainians have also attacked a locomotive in Bryansk with drones. That means, of course, even deep in the rear areas of Russia, Russian logistics are being attacked. And locomotives are, of course, necessary for logistics. We have more videos here where a drone hits a truck 60 kilometers behind the front in Donetsk. We saw the impact here directly on a vehicle, and this was geolocated 150 kilometers behind the front. Again, attacks on Russian positions. That means we see the attacks throughout the entire rear area. Here we have another recording. Up here, we can see the drone, which is obviously being filmed from inside a vehicle, while the drone is leisurely flying over the road in the south of Ukraine. That should be the land bridge. I haven't seen any geolocation regarding this yet, but the context and the explanation also suggested that. And what you can't see clearly yet is what's here. Namely, here is a Russian military truck that the drone pilot is now obviously recognizing. We can see it here. And then, obviously, something went wrong, because the drone crashes into the trees and explodes. So it doesn't hit the vehicle. But even here, it shows us that Ukraine can operate far enough behind enemy lines to attack individual trucks there now. Of course, we also have more footage showing us hornets on the hunt. Here too, there's footage of a hornet flying along the road in southern Ukraine. We can see it here. Here, it's obvious that a Ukrainian pilot is involved and is looking for valuable targets, while civilian vehicles are driving below and passing by. And so we have numerous recordings of attacks. No, that was the same footage. We now have a recording here. A Russian mill blogger, Alex Parker Returns, is talking about it. The Ukrainians are already publishing numerous videos of attacks on trucks deep in the rear area. If this continues, they could cause a logistical collapse in the new regions by autumn. Then you might even have to block Messenger Max, not just Telegram. That's a sarcastic remark, meaning that communication would have to be interrupted even more, not just targeted by attacks. Alex Parker Returns is probably an ultra-nationalist living outside of Russia, who doesn't hold back with criticism of the Russian government and the Russian military, because he obviously doesn't fear prosecution, but he is clearly on the side of the Russians in this conflict. And because of these attacks, the governor of Kherson has now banned private traffic on the RR-280 due to the Ukrainian attacks. That was probably the road here where they are traveling. That means no civilian vehicles are allowed to travel there anymore. And the Russian mill blogger Reba complains. According to information that has appeared on the internet, traffic for heavy-duty vehicles is being restricted, except for military goods, special transports, medicines, and reconstruction equipment, fuel, perishable foods, and certain socially important staple foods. That means they have literally made it easier for the enemy to find and hit targets. The Ukrainian channels have already celebrated this. Now the drone operators of the Ukrainian armed forces can practically attack any truck, because according to the decree, every heavy-duty transporter is now carrying something important. So, on the Russian side, they are absolutely not thrilled that their own military can no longer hide among civilian vehicles, and that now the Ukrainians can attack any vehicle, because all of this also has consequences. Here we have Alex Parker again, and here are the consequences of the gradual loss of security on the land corridor to Crimea. In Sevastopol, due to logistical difficulties whose causes are known, restrictions on the sale of fuel have been introduced. According to local authorities, only 20 liters of gasoline are given per vehicle. Diesel is only available with vouchers. Crimea is once again turning into a logistical dead end. Yes, the governor of Sevastopol has rationed fuel. Russia will have to respond to this. They will have to start with nets over the roads. But with the roads we've seen, it's much more complicated, also because they're wide and there's plenty of space around them, even for expansion, which makes building defensive tunnels a bit more difficult. They will have to set up warning stations, install radar devices to detect drones. They will have to provide air defense systems and teams. Only then does the question arise, where will the equipment and personnel come from to fight the drones in this entire area? Especially since we're really talking about thousands of square kilometers here. If we look at it, practically this entire area is now within range of the Ukrainians. And in theory, everything here has to be protected. Everything has to be monitored. Of course, the Russians can try to bypass this by using side roads, but in the long run, those will also be attacked. On the other hand, they are much less efficient, because if Russia has to use side roads, the trips will take longer. Main roads are used for a good reason, and using side roads causes more wear and tear on vehicles, because side roads are often not of the same quality. And here, you have to say, the Ukrainian plan is clearly working. After the Ukrainians have caused wear and tear on the Russian air defenses for years, a tipping point has now been reached where Russia can no longer counter this with just air defense. Ukrainian drones can now effectively target Russian targets deeper behind the front lines. It's no longer just large targets at risk, like headquarters and depots, but now even individual vehicles, which increasingly threatens to paralyze the entire Russian logistics. This increasingly weakens the Russians at the front each day, because, of course, they have to worry about being actively threatened further and further behind the front lines. And that's a situation that is hardly bearable in the long run, and it also causes enormous damage to morale. And at the same time, of course, every truck that breaks down means less material reaches the front, which weakens the Russians there. Meanwhile, the Russians are also attacking. The Ukrainians report that a truck was hit near Kharkiv. The police then arrived because a traffic accident was originally reported, or it was understood as a traffic accident. And then a second drone attacked the police. The police officers were able to get to safety, but their car was hit. The truck driver was killed, and that's why a detour for civilian traffic has now been set up north of Kharkiv. On this road that we see here, vehicles are no longer allowed to drive. No civilian traffic is permitted anymore. It now has to be diverted to the south. So the exact same effect is happening on the Ukrainian side, of course, except that it's very close to the front there, because Kharkiv isn't exactly a frontline city, but it's not far from it either. We're talking about an area like this one here, and we're 20 kilometers from the front. We're not talking about 150 kilometers in the rear area. A new use of drones has also been observed on the Russian side. Again, we'll go through this a bit faster, so as not to drag things out too much. Here we can see a Russian fiber optic drone, the Ruby from Rubicon, as it flies toward a Ukrainian substation. And here we can see, pay attention to this. Here we see a construction worker, here a crane, and a vehicle, building something here. And now is the moment when he notices that the drone is next to him, and he runs away, and you can see a second person running away as well. Luckily, the drone is not chasing them. It flies over here, and then crashes into a substation. We can quickly play that, so it crashes here. But here too, we can see that the Ukrainians are working on reinforcing the whole thing. We can see reinforcements here. They're building with bricks, and in the middle, they're probably pouring concrete, I would assume. I don't know if, yes, that's concrete that's probably being poured. That means, from the Ukrainian side, we can see how they're working to secure their power supply. In this case, it's too late, because the Russian attack has already gotten through here. Meanwhile, the Russians are also carrying out work, and there are now reports about the construction of additional hangars for the Russian Air Force, now in Kaliningrad. At the beginning, the Russians had no protected shelters for their aircraft at all, which the Ukrainians took great advantage of. In the meantime, the Russians have started building such protective structures in more and more places. This can now be observed in the Kaliningrad region, which is the old Königsberg. Meanwhile, Russia's nuclear weapons exercises have ended. Russia's nuclear delivery systems were tested during this, mainly nuclear-capable missiles and cruise missiles. And at the same time, it has become known that Russia may be working on underwater missile launch bases in order to strengthen its nuclear deterrence in this way. The idea behind this is probably that there are stationary bases on the seabed or launch tubes for nuclear missiles. And these can only be detected through active searching, meaning a ship or a submarine has to be there, actively scanning the seabed and looking for irregularities. And above all, it compares it with earlier databases. But of course, all of this only works if it was built in the meantime. If the installation is set up after such a passage and such an inspection, then it goes undetected again. The, containers. Containery. If nuclear missiles are parked in containers on the seabed in this way, Russia has created a second strike capability in an interesting way. Because unlike SSBNs, that is, nuclear-powered missile submarines, which are normally responsible for the second strike, containers of course make no noise, and can therefore only be found with active sensors. So here we see a development by the Russians to strengthen their nuclear deterrence. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are working on privatizing air defense, with the first companies already involved, meaning that the private sector is participating in the defense against incoming threats. And we also have news from the political sphere, because Putin's visit to China was expected to bring a breakthrough in the power of Siberia 2 pipeline. We talked about this in the live stream, where I said that Putin's visit to Russia was most likely about money, specifically to support the Russian economy with Chinese money. This pipeline is, of course, a way to get money. It is supposed to bring Russian natural gas to China to compensate for the losses in Europe, where not much is being sold anymore. China is now aware of its role, that Russia can practically only build a pipeline to it and has no other profitable alternative, because there simply aren't any other nations that buy significant amounts of gas and can be reached by pipeline. And that gives China enormous bargaining power, which China shamelessly uses. According to reports, the negotiations haven't progressed because China wants to buy the gas at ridiculously low prices, which simply means, for the Russians, that it's still not profitable. But who else could Russia deliver the gas to via pipeline? In the end, Russia will have to come to an agreement with China, or it will have to consider what to do with the gas, because it won't be able to deliver it by pipeline to anyone else in any significant amount. At the same time, it's reported that Russia's gold reserves have fallen for the 4th month in a row, and bankruptcies among small and medium-sized businesses in Russia are also increasing. All of this is, of course, a sign of the tense economic situation in Russia, which is caused by the war and the increased spending on the war. Russia has massively increased taxes and greatly expanded the range of things that are taxed. Of course, this is hurting the economy. Meanwhile, Lukashenko from Belarus emphasizes that Belarus has no interest in entering the war, Zelensky has repeatedly made statements that they are preparing in case Belarus intervenes. He himself now emphasizes that they have no interest in it. Of course, you have to consider that if he actually wanted to join, he would hardly announce it publicly. But for the sake of completeness, here is this statement. And from the US, a sale of new Hawk equipment has been reported. This is a medium-range air defense system that is being used in Ukraine. It's actually quite outdated, but it's still good enough for cruise missiles. And the US has sold spare parts and accessories worth $108 million to keep these air defense systems in service. As I said, not for state-of-the-art fighter jets, but for cruise missiles, and also for large drones, etc. The system can still be used if it is properly maintained, and that's what this sale will ensure. Once again, thanks to the sponsor of today's video, CyberGhost VPN. If you subscribe using the link below, you'll get an 83% discount. And that's it for the update at this point. If you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. Leave a comment if you have something to add. And if you're new here, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future videos. The next live stream is tomorrow at 8 p.m. German time, where we'll give an update on the war in Ukraine, but of course also on the situation in the Persian Gulf, followed by a Q&A session where you can ask your questions. If you don't want to miss that, as I said, subscribe to the channel. That's all from my side for now. Thank you for your attention, and see you soon. At this point, my special thanks also go to Lieutenant Colonel Mori, as well as Lieutenant Jan von Eck, Uwe Diefel, nickname Tubib, Carsten Schulz, Orikhiv, Vision Sound, Lichtstatter, NTX, Malermeister Nagel, Markus F., Alex Rosenthal, Matt Best, Zig 66, with 1000 Sascha Müller, Cunningham, you stress. Thank you very much. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. At this point, my special thanks also go to Lieutenant Colonel Mori, as well as Lieutenants Jans von Eck, Uwe de Vreen, nickname Tubib, Carsten Schulz, Robert Viel, Vision, Soundlab, Lichtstatter, NTX, Malermeister Nagel, Markus F. Alex Rosenthal, Matt Best, Zig 666, Möter 1000 Janis Gü, Sascha Müller, Cunningham, Eustress. Thank you very much. Without you, this wouldn't be possible.